It wasn't meant to end like this. When Sarah first brought up the idea of the party, I didn't think much of it. We had been married long enough for me to know her habits. A night out with Tara and her group, a few drinks, maybe some dancing. Nothing too extreme. At least that's what I thought back then. But something about this particular party felt different. Maybe it was the way she casually mentioned it, or perhaps it was the fact that Tara had a history of throwing parties where anything could happen. I tried not to read too much into it, but my instincts wouldn't let me shake the feeling. I knew her well enough to notice the subtle changes, the way she'd been distracted recently, the late nights with little explanation. We'd argued about it before, but this time it wasn't just frustration or jealousy on my part. This time, it felt like something was slipping, something crucial. The night before the party, I told her how I felt. "I don't think you should go," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's not that I don't trust you, Sarah, but lately I don't know. It feels like we're not on the same page anymore." I didn't expect her to respond the way she did. "You're being paranoid again," she snapped, her eyes narrowing. "It's just a party Tara's throwing, not some random stranger. Why do you always do this?" The word "always" hit me harder than I expected. She made it sound like I was constantly monitoring her, smothering her with suspicion. But that wasn't the case. I had given her space, let her live her life, trusting that our bond was strong enough to endure whatever temptations came her way. But lately, she had been distant, both emotionally and physically. We still lived together, but it felt like she was slipping away. "I'm not trying to control you," I said, struggling to stay calm. "I'm just telling you how I feel. Something about this party doesn't sit right with me. I don't like it. Can we at least talk about it?" She rolled her eyes, brushing me off as if my concerns were nothing but petty insecurities. "Talk about what? You're acting like I'm going to run off with some guy the second I walk through the door. It's just a night out, for God's sake." But that wasn't it. It wasn't just a night out. It was everything that had been building over the past few months. The distance, the late nights with vague explanations, the way she no longer seemed present when we were together. I felt like I was losing her little by little, and this party felt like the tipping point. But instead of pushing the issue further, I let her go. I don't know why. Maybe I was tired of fighting, tired of always being the one trying to hold us together, while she seemed more eager to drift apart. So when she left that night, I didn't stop her. But I couldn't just sit idly by. As the hours stretched on, I found myself pacing the house, my mind racing with all the thoughts I didn't want to have. The silence was deafening. By midnight, I hadn't heard a word from her. No call, no text. Just the emptiness of the house. I made a choice, one that would alter everything. I grabbed my phone, opened the tracking app we had set up months ago when she kept misplacing her phone, and I tracked her. It felt wrong, invasive even, but in that moment, I didn't care. I needed to know where she was, what she was doing, and I had to know the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The app loaded, and her location appeared. I expected it to show her at Tara's house, maybe a nearby bar. But instead, it displayed something that made my stomach drop. A motel on the outskirts of town. I stared at the screen, trying to make sense of it. A motel? What on earth was she doing there? My heart began to race, anger and dread building within me. This wasn't just a party. Something else was going on, something I had refused to let myself believe. Without a second thought, I grabbed my keys and left the house. The drive to the motel felt like it took forever, though it was probably only about 20 minutes. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly, my knuckles turned white. I could feel the blood pounding in my ears, my heart thundering with every passing mile. I kept checking my phone, watching Sarah's location blink on the screen, still at the motel, unmoving. I wanted to turn around, to pretend I hadn't seen it. A part of me hoped it was some mistake, that she was there for an entirely innocent reason, and that I was just overreacting. But deep down, I knew. The distance that had grown between us over the last few months wasn't just in my head. It wasn't merely stress or work. It was something deeper, something darker. When I arrived at the parking lot, I parked a little farther from the building, not wanting to attract attention. Only a few cars were there, none of which I recognized. I sat there for a moment, hands gripping the steering wheel, staring at the neon sign for Westmore Motel, the faint buzz of the lights echoing in the quiet of the night. The place was old, the kind of location people visited when they wanted to stay hidden, cheap and private. It was the ideal spot for affairs or secrets. I opened the app again, my thumb hovering above the screen, waiting as if it would show me something new. But the little dot hadn't moved. She was still there, in one of those rooms. The room number wasn't listed, but there were only a few options. I stepped out of the car and walked across the parking lot, trying to steady my breathing, trying not to imagine the worst. The cool night air didn't help calm my nerves. My mind raced through all the worst possibilities. Images of Sarah in a room with someone else, laughing, smiling, doing the things she hadn't done with me for months, flashed in my mind. I walked past a few rooms, each door marked with a faded number, 2011, 202, 203. As I neared the end of the row, I slowed my pace, my heart pounding in my chest. I stopped at the last few rooms, scanning the parking lot, and then I saw it. Her car, parked at the far end, hidden away as though she didn't want anyone to notice. That was all the confirmation I needed. I stood there for a moment, staring at her car, the weight of the truth crashing down on me. There was no more denying it, no more excuses. She was here, at a motel, and there was no good reason for it. The trust we once had was shattered, replaced by something I didn't want to face. I walked to the door of the room nearest her car, my fists clenched at my sides. Room 214. The blinds were drawn, and the faint light from a lamp spilled out around the edges. I hesitated, my breath shallow. Did I really want to know what was on the other side of that door? Did I truly want to see it? Yes. I had to. I raised my hand to knock, but stopped just inches away. Instead, I pressed my ear against the door. At first, there was only silence, but then faint voices, hers, laughing softly, followed by a man's voice. It was muffled, but enough to send a surge of anger through me. I didn't need to hear more. Without thinking, I slammed my fist against the door. The voices inside stopped immediately. I could hear the sound of movement, shuffling, and whispers. Panic. My mind was racing, my body trembling with adrenaline. I knocked again, louder this time. "Sarah, open the door!" I shouted, my voice cracking with fury. For a moment, there was only silence. Then the door opened just a crack, enough for me to see her face. She looked pale, shocked, as if she couldn't believe I was standing there. Her hair was disheveled, her makeup smeared, like she'd been caught in the middle of something she couldn't talk her way out of. "What the hell are you doing here?" she hissed, her voice low, her eyes darting around, checking to see if anyone else was watching. I didn't care about the scene. "What am I doing here? What are you doing here?" I snapped, pushing the door open wider. I could see the room now, rumpled sheets on the bed, and a man sitting on the edge, equally stunned. He wasn't anyone I recognized, just some random guy, exactly as I had feared. Sarah stepped out, closing the door behind her, trying to block my view. "This isn't what it looks like," she said, her voice trembling, but her eyes betrayed her. She was scrambling, desperate to regain control of the situation. I laughed bitterly. "Isn't it? Because from where I'm standing, it looks exactly like what it is." I couldn't believe this was happening. Couldn't believe how easily she had betrayed me. After everything, after all the chances I had given her, she was here, doing this. She reached out, trying to grab my arm. "Let me explain," she pleaded, her voice shaking. But I pulled away, disgusted. "Explain? Explain what, Sarah? You're here, in a motel, with him?" I said, my voice hard, each word carrying the weight of her betrayal. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. For the first time, she couldn't lie her way out of it. And that's when I knew. It was over. There was nothing left to salvage. Everything between us, all I had held on to, was in ruins. Sarah's arm fell limply at her side, and the expression on her face shifted from shock to something colder, more guarded, as though she were already calculating her next move. The man inside the room hadn't even bothered to step out. He stayed seated, likely hoping I would just leave, too much of a coward to confront the mess he had a hand in creating. "This isn't what you think," Sarah said, her tone steadier now, as though trying to regain control of the situation. But it was pointless. I had already seen all I needed to. Just let me explain, okay? Can we go somewhere and talk? She pleaded. I shook my head, disbelief and anger swirling inside me like a storm. Talk? What is there to discuss, Sarah? You're standing outside a motel room with another man. I've been agonizing, thinking something was wrong between us, and here you are proving me right. Her gaze darted toward the door, briefly glancing at the guy inside before returning to me. She looked panicked, scrambling for a way to twist this, to make it seem like something it wasn't. It's not what you think, she began again, her voice faltering. It's just, things haven't been right between us for a while, and I didn't know how to handle it. I came here to clear my head. To clear your head? That's what this is. I cut her off, my voice rising. Don't insult me, Sarah. You're caught. Don't stand here pretending this is anything other than what it is. She took a step closer, her expression softening, as if she thought she could still salvage this, still manipulate the situation. I'm sorry, okay? I messed up. I know I did. But let's talk about this somewhere. Figure it out. Figure it out. The phrase echoed in my mind, empty and meaningless. What was left to figure out when the person I trusted most had been deceiving me for months? I stepped back, increasing the distance between us. No, Sarah, you don't understand. I'm done. There's nothing left to figure out. The moment you walked into that room, you made your choice. You didn't care about us then, and you don't care now. Her mouth opened as if to respond, but I didn't let her. Was it worth it? I asked, my voice quieter now, no longer fueled by anger, but by pure exhaustion. I felt drained, worn down by the months I'd spent carrying the weight of our failing relationship alone. Was it worth destroying everything we had? Because I'm done fighting for someone who walked away long ago. For a moment she was silent, her eyes dropping to the ground. Her mask cracked just enough for me to glimpse the guilt underneath. But the guilt wasn't for me. It was for herself. She was sorry she got caught, sorry things weren't playing out the way she'd hoped. I didn't mean for this to happen, she murmured, her voice trembling slightly. I didn't think it would go this far. I stared at her, incredulous. Go this far? Sarah, you've been lying to me for months. You've been disappearing, coming up with excuses, while I sat at home blaming myself. And now you're telling me you didn't mean for it to go this far? That's all you have to say? She looked up, her eyes desperate. Please, I don't want this to be the end. We can fix this. I'll end it with him, I swear. I'll make it right. I laughed, but it wasn't out of humor. It was the hollow, bitter laugh of someone who had finally hit their breaking point, who realized just how irreparable things had become. End it with him? Sarah, it was already over the moment you chose to lie. The moment you decided to choose him over us, it was done. You can't make it right now. The tears began then. Whether they were genuine or not, I couldn't tell anymore. She stood there, wiping her face, trying to look remorseful. But it didn't matter. The damage was done, and no amount of tears could undo it. I felt nothing but an empty, resigned numbness. You need to leave, I said quietly, my anger having given way to sheer exhaustion. Go back inside. Do whatever you want. But don't come home. We're done. Her head shook violently, panic overtaking her features again. Please, don't say that. Don't just throw us away like this. Throw us away? I repeated, my anger sparking one final time. You already did that, Sarah. I'm just finishing what you started. I turned and walked away, each step heavier but more certain than the last. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see the regret on her face or hear any more of her lies and apologies. As I got into my car, I felt the weight of finality settle in, both crushing and freeing. Here's the paraphrased version of the text, following your guidelines. The reality of it all struck me. It was over. Years of marriage, love, and trust were shattered in one night. Yet, as I drove away from that motel, I felt an unexpected emotion, relief. It was as though I had been carrying an unbearable burden for months, struggling to mend something already beyond repair. At least now, the truth was out, and the endless battle was finally done. While I drove away, the weight of the night bore down on me. My hands clutched the steering wheel tightly, knuckles pale, as the city lights streaked past. The adrenaline began to fade, leaving behind a hollow numbness that seeped deep into my core. I wasn't angry anymore, nor did I feel betrayed. I just felt empty. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. Not with a half-hearted apology in front of a rundown motel. Not with Sarah pleading for a reconciliation we both knew was impossible. I had spent years convincing myself that we could overcome anything, that the challenges we faced were temporary hurdles. But standing in that parking lot, watching her web of lies unravel piece by piece, I came to a stark realization. The Sarah I married no longer existed. Perhaps she had been gone for a long time. As I pulled into the driveway, the sight of our house brought no solace. It appeared unchanged, yet it felt entirely different. This wasn't home anymore. Just a building, a place where two people had drifted apart, clinging to the pretense of something that had died long before tonight. I stayed in the car for a while, staring at the front door, fully aware that stepping inside would mean facing everything. I wasn't ready for that, not the memories, not the silence. So I sat there, replaying the last few months in my mind, scrutinizing every moment when I should have noticed the warning signs. The unexplained late nights, the way she'd act as if everything were fine, despite the growing distance between us, and the countless instances I tried to reach out, tried to connect, only to be shut down as though my concerns were baseless. How long had she been unfaithful? How long had she been hiding it from me? A wave of bitterness began to rise in my chest, but I suppressed it. There was no use in anger now. The truth was, I had lost her months ago. I had simply been too stubborn to accept it. Finally, I forced myself to step out of the car and enter the house. It was dark and silent, just as it had been when she left earlier. I tossed my keys onto the counter and stood in the kitchen as the weight of everything came crashing down on me. I glanced at the clock. It was 2 a.m. She'd probably return soon, or so I thought. The argument outside the motel had been harsh, cutting, but I knew Sarah well enough to expect she wouldn't just vanish. She would come back, try to explain, and plead with me to believe we could still fix things. But I was finished. I walked to the fridge, grabbed a beer, and sank into the couch, staring blankly at the wall as I took a long sip. The bitterness of the drink didn't matter. It felt like I needed something, anything, to pierce through the emptiness settling over me. My mind drifted to the night we moved into this house. We'd been married for 2 years then, still caught up in that honeymoon glow where everything seemed perfect. I remembered how thrilled Sarah had been, how we'd spent hours unpacking, laughing, and dreaming about the future. We had so many plans, big plans, kids, vacations, a life we'd build together. That felt like a lifetime ago. All I could think about now was the look on her face when she opened the motel door. Panic, guilt, and yet, still, deceit. Even when caught in the act, she tried to twist things, to convince me there was something left worth saving, as if we could brush everything under the rug and pretend it was fine. But there was no going back, not anymore. The sound of the front door opening broke through my thoughts, and I heard her footsteps in the hallway. She paused, probably uncertain if I was still there. I didn't move. I didn't say anything. I simply sat there, sipping my beer and staring at the wall, bracing for what would come next. She entered the living room, her face pale, her eyes swollen from crying. She looked different now, as though the weight of everything had finally caught up to her. Here's the rewritten version of your text, based on the guidelines. The realization finally hit her, but it no longer mattered. The damage was already done. She lowered herself into the chair across from me, careful not to get too close. For a while, we just sat in silence, the space between us feeling as vast as an ocean. "Can we talk?" she eventually whispered, her voice unsteady. At first, I didn't respond. I didn't even glance in her direction. Instead, I took another sip of my beer, allowing the quiet to stretch out until it became suffocating. "What's there to discuss?" I asked at last, my tone cold and distant. "You've said enough." She dropped her gaze and wiped her eyes. "I know I messed up. I know I hurt you. But I promise, it wasn't—" Her voice broke. "It wasn't what it looked like." I couldn't stop myself from laughing, the sound harsh and bitter. "It wasn't what it looked like, Sarah. I caught you in a motel room with another man. How much worse could it possibly get? It was a mistake," she said desperately, her voice cracking under the weight of her words. I wasn't thinking clearly. I was scared. I didn't know how to fix things between us, and I made a terrible choice. But it's not what you think. At that, I turned to face her, my expression hard. You cheated, Sarah. You lied. And you're still lying, even now. Just stop. Admit it. Stop pretending it's something it isn't. She recoiled at my words, fresh tears pooling in her eyes. I'm not lying. I know how it looks, but it was a one-time thing. It didn't mean anything. I was lost, and I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't know how to deal with everything. I stared at her, feeling the anger inside me churn again. But this time, it wasn't fiery or explosive. It was cold and settled, the kind of anger that comes when you realize you're done. It's over, Sarah, I said quietly, setting my beer down. There's no fixing this. You made your choice. Now you have to live with it. She shook her head, her voice rising in desperation. Please don't say that. I love you. I don't want to lose you. I stood, heading toward the hallway. You already have. As I left the room, her sobs followed me, but I didn't turn back. The truth was out, and it was time to move on. I walked down the hallway and into the bedroom, softly closing the door behind me. Sarah's cries echoed faintly from the living room, but I forced myself to block them out. Sitting on the edge of the bed, I felt the weight of everything settle on my shoulders. But it wasn't the heartbreak or fiery anger I'd expected. It was a hollow kind of finality. I knew this was the end. The room felt colder than usual, as if it didn't belong to me anymore. My eyes drifted over the familiar space, the pictures on the walls, the little details of a life we'd built together. Photos of vacations, our wedding day, smiling moments that once felt perfect. But now, none of it seemed real. It was like looking at someone else's life, someone else's memories. I focused on one picture in particular, us on our honeymoon, standing on a beach somewhere far away, laughing as if nothing in the world could touch us. How had it all fallen apart so quickly? Or maybe it hadn't been quick at all. Maybe it had been breaking down for a long time, and I just hadn't noticed until now. Maybe Sarah's betrayal was simply the last straw in a relationship we'd both been quietly dismantling for years. A soft knock at the door interrupted my thoughts. I didn't answer, but Sarah pushed the door open anyway. She stood there, pale and tear-streaked, looking like she wanted to say something that might change everything. Can we just talk, please? She whispered, lingering in the doorway, hesitant, almost as if she knew there was nothing left to say. I looked at her, the woman I had once loved, the one I had built a life with. But now she felt like a stranger who had made choices I couldn't understand, a stranger who had thrown everything away for a fleeting, selfish moment. What is there to talk about, Sarah? I asked, my voice flat. Do you really think more words will fix this? That we can somehow go back to what we had? We're past that, far past it. She stepped into the room, wrapping her arms around herself like she was trying to hold herself together. I know I ruined everything, she said, her voice trembling. But I don't want to lose you. I'll do anything to make this right. I'll end things with him. I'll end it. My voice cut through the air, sharper than I meant it to be. There's nothing left to end, Sarah. I don't care about him. I don't care about your excuses. The second you decided to step into that motel room, you ended us. Her face crumpled at my words, fresh tears streaming down her cheeks. Please, she whispered, her voice cracking. I love you. I know I made a terrible mistake, but I still love you. We can fix this. I know we can. I shook my head slowly, the ache in my chest mingling with something colder. You love me? I echoed, my voice low. Are you sure about that? Because it doesn't feel like love. It feels like guilt, and that's not enough to fix what you've broken. She collapsed onto the bed, burying her face in her hands as her sobs grew louder. But I couldn't reach for her. I couldn't comfort her the way I once would have, because the truth was, I didn't trust her anymore. Not after this. Not after what she'd done. I stood up, the decision already solidified in my mind. I'm leaving, Sarah, I said, my voice steady. I can't stay here and pretend we can fix this. We're done. She looked up at me, panic flashing in her eyes. What do you mean you're leaving? Where will you go? I didn't have an answer. I hadn't thought that far ahead. All I knew was that I couldn't stay in this house, in this life we had built on lies. I don't know yet, I admitted, but I'll figure it out. I just know I can't stay. She stood up, reaching for me, her voice desperate. Please don't go. Don't just walk out like this. We can go to therapy. We can work through this. I'll do whatever it takes. I stepped back, out of her reach, shaking my head. Number, this isn't something therapy can fix, Sarah. You crossed a line, and there's no coming back from it. You made your choice, and now I'm making mine. The silence between us was heavy, almost unbearable. For a moment, I nearly regretted it, almost wished I could return to the days when life was simpler, when we were happy. But those days were gone, and pretending otherwise would only drag us both further down. I grabbed a duffel bag from the closet and began tossing in a few essentials. Clothes, my laptop, whatever I thought I'd need for a few days away. Sarah watched, her face falling with every item I packed. It was as if each piece of clothing represented another part of the life we had shared, being taken away. When I zipped up the bag and slung it over my shoulder, she stepped in front of me, blocking the door. You can't just leave, she said, her voice trembling. I love you. Please don't throw us away like this. I met her gaze, feeling the weight of her words, but knowing deep down they were too little. Too late. I'm not throwing anything away, Sarah. You did that. I'm just walking away from the wreckage. I stepped around her and walked out of the bedroom. The house felt colder, emptier than it ever had, but I didn't look back. I didn't let myself hesitate. The front door clicked shut behind me, and for the first time in a long time, I felt something close to freedom. The moment the door closed behind me, the weight of everything began to lift. It wasn't the rush of relief I'd hoped for, but a quiet emptiness, the kind of silence that lingers after a storm, when the destruction is all around, but at least the chaos has passed. I got into my car and sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel and staring out at the empty street. I had no plan, no destination in mind. All I knew was that I couldn't stay in that house for another second. The life I'd built with Sarah was over, and now I had to figure out how to create something new, something that didn't include her. I drove aimlessly for a while, the streets deserted at this late hour. My thoughts raced, but at the same time, I felt strangely numb. I replayed every word we'd exchanged, every plea she'd made, but none of it changed the cold truth of what had happened. She had shattered something between us that couldn't be repaired, no matter how many tears she cried or apologies she offered. After about 20 minutes, I found myself pulling into the parking lot of a cheap motel. I parked in the back, the irony not lost on me, considering everything. Sure, here's a fully paraphrased version based on your guidelines. I wasn't in the mood to think about where this night had begun. All I needed was a spot to crash, a place where I could gather my thoughts without the oppressive weight of that house hanging over me. The motel was every bit as run down as I had expected, flickering fluorescent lights in the hallways, thin walls, and the lingering stench of stale cigarette smoke. But none of that mattered. I paid in cash, checked in, and made my way down the poorly lit corridor, the sound of my footsteps echoing off the walls. When I stepped into the room, it was just as dismal as I'd envisioned. Worn-out furniture, a bed that looked like comfort had abandoned it years ago, and a flickering TV I had no intention of turning on. But none of that mattered. This wasn't home. It wasn't supposed to be. It was just a place to exist for one night, somewhere I wouldn't have to think about what came next. I tossed my duffel bag onto the bed, sat beside it, and ran my fingers through my hair, trying to settle the storm in my mind. It was strange. This was the first time in years I found myself truly alone. No Sarah, no pretending we were fine. Just me, sitting in a drab motel room, attempting to make sense of how my life had unraveled in a single evening. I pulled out my phone and stared at it, unsure if I should call anyone. My best friend Mark was probably asleep, and I didn't think I was ready to explain everything yet. Scrolling through my contacts, I hovered over his name for a moment before setting the phone down again. The truth was, I wasn't ready to talk about it, not yet. Instead, I leaned back on the bed, staring at the ceiling as the silence closed in around me. My mind drifted back to the argument in the bedroom, to the way Sarah had begged me to stay, to forgive her, to fix what was broken. What she didn't seem to understand was that some things can't be fixed. You can't just cover up betrayal and hope the wound heals. Trust doesn't work like that. It's not something you can simply piece back together once it's been shattered. I had given her everything, years of my life, my loyalty, my trust, and she had thrown it away. For what? Some fleeting thrill or escape she thought she needed. It wasn't just the cheating. It was the lies, the months of growing distance, and the way she had let our marriage decay from the inside while pretending everything was fine. I rolled onto my side, the motel bed creaking beneath me, and tried to close my eyes. But sleep wouldn't come. My mind replayed the moment I had caught her at the motel, the way she looked at me, panic written all over her face when she realized the game was up. It was like a broken record in my head, stuck on repeat, refusing to let me move on. Grabbing my phone again, I scrolled through old photos, pictures of Sarah and me from happier times. There was one of us on a hike, smiling for the camera, arms wrapped around each other, looking like the picture-perfect couple. It was hard to reconcile the people in those photos with the ones who had stood in that bedroom hours earlier, tearing each other apart. Morning light filtered through the thin motel curtains, casting a faint glow over the room. I woke up groggy, the stiffness in my neck a harsh reminder that this was no place for comfort. It took a moment for my mind to clear, and when it did, the memories of the previous night came flooding back. That hollow ache in my chest returned, but it felt a little more distant now. I sat up, rubbed my eyes, and glanced at my phone on the nightstand, half expecting to see a barrage of missed calls or texts from Sarah. I was surprised to find nothing. Part of me felt relief. Another part wondered if she had given up trying to reach me, or if she was waiting for me to come crawling back. But I wasn't going back. I knew I couldn't keep all of this bottled up forever, though. I needed to talk to someone. Mark had faced his own share of tough times before, and he was one of the few people I trusted enough to confide in. I picked up my phone, scrolled to his name, and hesitated for a moment before pressing the call button. He answered after a couple of rings, his voice groggy but filled with concern. "Hey, man, everything okay?" I swallowed hard, searching for the right words. "Here's the fully paraphrased version, adhering to your requirements." "No," I finally said, my voice cracking slightly. "I left her, Mark. I'm at a motel right now." There was a pause on the other end, a silence that felt like someone carefully assembling the right response. "What happened?" he asked, his tone gentler now, as if he already understood this wasn't just some minor argument. "She's been unfaithful," I said, the words bitter and jagged. "I caught her last night at a motel with another guy." Mark let out a low, drawn-out sound, the kind you make when trying to absorb something too massive and awful to fully process. "Man, I'm so sorry. I didn't see that coming." "Neither did I," I replied. "I mean, I had my doubts, but not like this. She's been doing this for months." I confronted her, but she kept trying to lie her way out of it. "It's over. I'm done." Mark stayed quiet for a moment before asking, "Where are you now?" "Some rundown motel on the edge of town. I just couldn't stay at the house. I had to get out. Do you want me to come by? Maybe we could grab breakfast or something, talk things through." The thought of having someone there, someone not tangled up in the whirlwind of emotions, felt like a lifeline. "Yeah," I said, a small sense of relief breaking through. "That would help." We agreed to meet at a diner not far from where I was staying. As I got ready, I realized how desperately I needed this conversation. I couldn't carry this weight on my own anymore. The drive to the diner was short, but it felt endless, like I was leaving behind the ruins of the life I'd built and stepping into something unfamiliar. It wasn't exactly freedom yet, but it was a beginning. Mark was already there when I arrived, sitting in a corner booth with 2 steaming cups of coffee on the table. He waved as I walked in, his face a mix of concern and sympathy. As I slid into the booth, he pushed one of the cups toward me, knowing instinctively that I'd need it. "So," he said, leaning forward with his hands clasped around his mug, "tell me everything." And I did. I told him about the weeks of emotional distance, the growing unease, and the lies Sarah had woven. I described following her to the motel, the confrontation, and how she tried to manipulate the truth even after being caught. I laid it all out piece by piece, like unloading a burden I'd carried far too long. Mark listened intently, nodding here and there, his expression serious. When I finished, he leaned back in the booth, exhaling slowly. "Man, I'm sorry. There's no justification for what she did, but I'm glad you walked away." You can't come back from something like that. I nodded, sipping the coffee. I thought maybe we could fix things, but after last night, there's nothing left to fix. So, what's your plan now? He asked, genuinely curious. I haven't figured that out yet, I admitted. I'll have to go back to the house at some point, sort things out. Divorce, probably. Move out! The words felt foreign, like they weren't mine yet. Mark gave me a compassionate look. If you need a place to crash, my couch is always open. You don't have to be alone in that house right now. The offer was tempting, and I knew he meant it, but something inside me felt the need to face it directly. I needed to go back, to confront the remnants of my old life, if only to start making sense of it. Thanks, I said with a faint smile. I might take you up on that, but I think I need to go back. Just not yet. We spent the next hour talking, not just about Sarah, but about everything. Life, work, the little things that still felt normal in a world that suddenly didn't. It was comforting in a strange way, realizing that some things remained steady even when everything else crumbled. Mark had a way of making things seem simpler, reminding me this wasn't the end, just a painful chapter. As we finished breakfast and stepped into the crisp morning air, a new thought struck me. I wasn't as alone as I'd believed. I had friends. I had a life outside of this chaos with Sarah. For the first time since last night, I felt a flicker of hope. Not the naive kind that wished for everything to go back to the way it was, but the kind that whispered I could rebuild. Maybe, just maybe, I could find myself again in the aftermath. You'll get through this, Mark said, patting my shoulder as we said goodbye. You're stronger than you think. I nodded, watching him drive away as the morning sun climbed higher into the sky. As I slid into my car, his words lingered. He was right. I didn't feel strong right now, nor did I feel in control of my life. But I'd taken the first step, and sometimes that was all you could do. I sat in my car outside the diner, watching the sunlight stretch over the world. It felt like the first time I'd truly seen daylight in months, even though it had only been hours since I'd left the house. It was a strange feeling, standing on the edge of something new with no clear path forward. But at least I was moving. That was enough for now. I knew I couldn't stay in this limbo forever. There was still the house to face. Still Sarah. But instead of the suffocating weight of unanswered questions and regret, I felt a rare sense of calm. I didn't know all the answers yet, but for the first time, I wasn't looking backward. I wasn't trapped in thoughts of what I could have done differently or how things had spiraled. Here's the rewritten version of the text, as per your guidelines. What was done couldn't be undone. I decided to return to the house, not because I wanted to see her, but because I needed to start regaining control of my life. I had to face the mess, to deal with whatever remained. I wasn't the same person who had left the night before. That version of me had walked away consumed with anger and betrayal, still clinging to the faint hope that things might change. But now, I was just ready to move on. The drive back seemed quicker than usual, almost as if my mind had shifted into overdrive, zeroing in on the tasks ahead. The house came into view, our house, though it no longer felt like it belonged to us. It felt like a space where two people had once lived, but only one had truly cared about staying. As I pulled into the driveway, I noticed Sarah's car still parked out front. A small part of me had hoped she would have left by now, but deep down I knew better. She wasn't the type to leave. She'd cling to the idea that we could repair what was broken, but she didn't realize there was nothing left to fix. I stepped out of the car, the weight of what was about to happen pressing down on me. As I approached the front door, I took a deep breath before stepping inside. The air in the house felt dense, heavy, with the tension lingering from the night before. Sarah was seated at the kitchen table, staring at her phone, but she looked up the moment I entered. Her eyes were swollen, her face pale. "You came back," she said softly, her voice hopeful but fragile. I didn't answer right away. I just stood there, looking at her, trying to reconcile the woman before me with the one I had loved for years. But I couldn't. Too much had happened. "I didn't come back for us," I said finally, my voice steady but cold. "I came back to get things in order." She dropped her gaze, her hands trembling slightly. "I know you're angry. I know I messed up. But we can still—" "No," I interrupted sharply, cutting her off before she could continue spinning illusions. We can't. We're done, Sarah. Last night wasn't just a mistake. It was the truth coming out. You've been lying to me for months, and whatever we had, it's gone. I can't forgive that. She blinked, the reality of my words sinking in. Her mouth opened as if she wanted to argue, but then she closed it again, seeming to realize there was nothing left to say. I could see the pain in her eyes, but I didn't feel sorry for her. She had made her choices. So, what now? She asked, her voice barely audible. I sat down across from her, feeling an odd sense of calm. We end this. I'll get a lawyer. We'll divide the house, the finances, everything. I'll move out as soon as I find a place. There's no need to drag this out. She lowered her head again, nodding slowly. I guess I knew this was coming, she murmured. But I didn't think it would happen like this. Neither did I admitted. Though the truth was, I'd known for a while that something was wrong. I just hadn't wanted to accept it. For the next hour, we discussed logistics. It was clinical, almost like a business transaction. Who would keep the house, how the money would be split, and what steps we needed to take to finalize the divorce. Sarah tried to stay civil, but I could see the cracks in her composure. Every now and then, she glanced at me with eyes full of guilt, as if she wanted to say something that might fix everything. But she never did. There was nothing left to fix. When we were finished, I stood up, ready to leave. I had packed what I needed the night before, and didn't want to stay in the house a moment longer than necessary. As I grabbed my bag, Sarah rose too, her eyes glistening with fresh tears. I'm sorry, she said softly, for everything. I never meant to hurt you. I looked at her, feeling strangely detached. The words meant nothing now. They didn't change anything. I know, I said quietly, my tone final. But it's too late for that. And with that, I walked out the door, leaving behind the life we had built together. I didn't know exactly where I was going, maybe to Mark's place for a few nights, or perhaps to a hotel, until I found something more permanent. But as I drove away, something clicked. For the first time, I wasn't looking back. I wasn't replaying scenarios in my mind or wondering what I could have done differently to save the marriage. Instead, I was thinking about what lay ahead. How I would rebuild. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, it didn't terrify me. It felt liberating, and that was enough. The house, the memories, the lies, they were all behind me now. All I had to do was keep driving, keep moving forward, and that's exactly what I did. One by one, I deleted the photos. Each picture felt like a lie now, a reminder of what I had believed we had, but never really did. The more I scrolled, the more I realized how much of my life I'd poured into someone who wasn't the person I thought she was. Finally, I put the phone down and stared at the ceiling, letting the silence settle over me. There was no going back. I understood that now. No promises or apologies could undo what had happened. Sarah had made her choice, and now I had made mine. This was the first night of my new life, alone. But maybe that wasn't such a bad thing. Perhaps after everything, it was time to rediscover who I was without her, to reclaim the parts of myself I had lost in the years spent holding on to something already gone. As I drifted into a restless sleep, one thought echoed in my mind. It's over. And for once, that didn't scare me.